imagine packing up your entire life, just moving your family across this unforgiving desert and settling in a completely unfamiliar, scorching oasis.
Right. Not exactly a relaxing vacation.
No, definitely not. And you aren't doing this for, like, a new job or better farmland. You're doing it because an ancient book told you that a man was going to be born in that specific location a few hundred years in the future.
It sounds almost like, like a premise for a science fiction novel.
Yeah, exactly.
But according to the historical sources and the ancient texts we're examining today, this was a very real, documented phenomenon. We're looking at a scenario where entire communities, uprooted themselves based on the anticipation of just a single world-altering event.
And that event is the focus of our deep dive today. We are exploring a fascinating lecture series and a collection of sources titled The Life of Prophet Muhammad, the legacy of the greatest man who ever lived.
It's a massive topic.
It really is. And our mission here isn't to, debate theology or anything. We're here to impartially unpack the sheer legendary scale of the narrative presented in these texts. Because the sources argue his life wasn't just some spontaneous spark in history.
Right. It was deeply anticipated, like a centuries-long countdown.
Exactly.
Which completely shifts how you view historical timelines, I think. Usually we think of history as a series of unpredictable dominoes falling. Someone steps onto the stage and the script is just written in real time.
Yeah, making it up as they go.
Right. But the texts we're analyzing today propose something entirely different. They suggest a historical landscape that was heavily mapped out centuries before the main character even arrived.
To give you, the listener, a way to visualize this, think of it less like an old-school prophecy, maybe more like a modern blockchain ledger.
Oh, that's an interesting way to put it.
Yeah, so in a blockchain, you have all these independent, disconnected nodes, right?
Yeah.
And they all have to verify the exact same transaction for it to be valid.
Okay, I follow.
What our sources argue is that various ancient traditions, disparate texts, different languages, separate eras, they all acted as these independent nodes, pointing to and verifying one specific coordinate in time and space.
That is a highly effective way to frame it, because the anticipation wasn't just theoretical. To really grasp the weight of these ancient texts, the sources suggest we first have to understand the immediate, electrifying atmosphere on the ground in Arabia right before his prophethood.
It wasn't just scholars reading dusty scrolls.
No, exactly. It was a living, breathing expectation among the local people.
And the sources provide this incredibly vivid story that captures that exact atmosphere. So picture this. It's decades before the prophet's mission begins.
Okay.
There's a young boy lying in a fur gown in his family's courtyard in Arabia.
Yeah.
And he's listening to a Jewish neighbor from the Benu Abdil tribe.
A very specific, intimate detail.
Right. And this neighbor is engaged in a really heated debate with the local polytheists. Now, these locals are strict idolaters. The concept of an afterlife or resurrection or a day of judgment, completely alien to them.
Totally absurd in their worldview.
Yeah, they're openly mocking him, asking if he seriously believes people will be resurrected after death to face a fire.
And the neighbor's response, as documented in the histories, is just visceral. He tells them that anyone going into that hellfire would prefer being locked in the absolute hottest oven in their own house and just left there to bake.
Wow.
Yeah. And the locals are stunned by this level of absolute conviction. They look at him and demand to know his proof.
And here is where the narrative shifts from, a theological debate to a geographic countdown. The neighbor gestures toward Mecca and Yemen and says, a prophet is being sent from hereabouts in these lands.
And when they ask when this will happen, he actually looks down at that young boy in the fur gown and says, if this lad lives a normal lifespan, he will live to see this time.
And the boy eventually grew up, recounted the story, and noted that he absolutely did live to see the messenger of Allah arrive.
It's an incredible historical anecdote.
It is, but wait, I want to unpack the logistics here. If you're listening, you might be wondering, why was this Jewish neighbor there in the first place?
That brings us to a profound historical irony the sources highlight. The Jewish tribes hadn't just randomly ended up in Medina.
Right, they didn't just wander there.
No, according to their own histories, they had specifically migrated and settled in that region because they had decoded geographical clues from their ancient scriptures. They were positioning themselves at what they believed was the exact landing zone for the incoming prophet.
That is wild.
And during local disputes, they would even warn the Arab tribes of Medina. They'd say, a prophet is coming soon, and when he does, we will follow him and defeat you.
Okay, I'm I'm stuck on the paradox of that.
Mm.
So the tribes that moved across the desert specifically to wait for this prophet,
Yeah.
they ended up accidentally preparing the local Arab tribes to recognize him first.
That is the precise argument the historical texts make. The knowledge of the incoming prophet was so prevalent, so constantly used as a point of leverage in local arguments, that it inadvertently educated the local Arab population.
A massive backfire, politically speaking.
Exactly. When the Arabs of Medina eventually traveled to Mecca and met Prophet Muhammad, the sources describe this massive light bulb moment. They essentially said to each other, "This is the man we've been warned about. We need to follow him before they do."
Oh, wow. So the very people who had tracked the prophecies built the conceptual foundation for his sanctuary.
Yes, even though many of them ultimately chose not to follow him out of, geopolitical shifting and local rivalries.
It sets up this incredible tension. So what were these ancient texts that the migrating tribes were reading? How did they supposedly know so much about him?
Well, to answer that, the sources transition from the local courtyards of Arabia to the hard texts of the Old Testament. They point directly to a highly specific prophecy in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 18, verse 18.
Deuteronomy 18:18.
Okay. This particular verse is a cornerstone for the arguments we're analyzing today. The text states that God will raise up a prophet from among their brethren, like unto Moses, and will put his words in that prophet's mouth.
Like unto Moses.
Right. For centuries, being like Moses was the ultimate litmus test for the awaited figure.
Now, I have to jump in and play devil's advocate here. If I'm a listener raised in a Western tradition, my brain immediately goes to Jesus when I hear about a prophet arriving after Moses. How do the sources justify bypassing Jesus and applying this specific verse to Prophet Muhammad?
The sources address this very deliberately, and they do it by relying strictly on the logic and metrics provided by the ancient texts themselves.
Okay, what kind of metrics?
They argue that to find a prophet like Moses, you have to compare the historical profiles of Moses, Jesus, and Prophet Muhammad regarding their origins, their leadership, and their life paths. And when you do that, the structural similarities between Moses and Prophet Muhammad are strikingly aligned.
Let's slow down and look at those metrics because it's a pretty dense comparison. First, the texts look at origins.
Right. Moses had human parents and experienced a natural birth. Prophet Muhammad also had human parents and a natural birth.
But Jesus, according to both Christian and Islamic theology, had a miraculous birth without an earthly father.
Exactly. Furthermore, the texts point out that both Moses and Prophet Muhammad married and had children, whereas Jesus did not. But the core of the comparison hinges on the nature of their leadership.
Why does the text demand someone like Moses specifically?
Because Moses wasn't just a spiritual guide. He was a magistrate. He was a general. He was an earthly ruler who brought a completely new legal code, the Torah, and had the absolute civic authority to govern a society and enact capital punishment.
Oh, that distinction makes a lot of sense. It's the difference between a spiritual kingdom and a literal earthly nation.
Yes.
Because Jesus famously stated, "My kingdom is not of this world." He wasn't governing a city-state.
And he also explicitly stated that he came to fulfill the old law of Moses, not to bring a new one. The sources emphasize that Prophet Muhammad, like Moses, arrived with a comprehensive new law, the Quran, and established a physical earthly governance.
So they were both nation builders.
Precisely. They both led their people out of persecution in a defining mass migration. For Moses, it was the Exodus. For Prophet Muhammad, it was the Hijrah.
A migration so foundational that the Islamic calendar literally begins with that event.
Right. And both men were ultimately victorious over their adversaries. In a worldly sense, both died natural deaths, and both were buried in the earth.
When you lay it out not just as a list of fun facts, but as a framework for what type of leader the text is demanding, the argument becomes very clear. The sources are saying the prophecy demands a nation builder, not solely a spiritual savior.
That's the exact argument.
Okay, so if the texts establish he must be a nation builder like Moses, the next logical question the sources tackle is his lineage. Where exactly does he come from?
This is where we look at the specific phrasing, from among their brethren. The text doesn't say from among themselves, which would imply a fellow Israelite.
Oh, I see.
To decode brethren, the sources take us back to the patriarch Abraham. Abraham had two sons who became patriarchs of massive lineages: Isaac, the father of the Israelites, and Ishmael, the father of the Arabs.
Therefore, if you are an Israelite, your brethren are the descendants of Ishmael.
Exactly. The texts argue this phrasing mathematically rules out an Israelite prophet and points a massive neon arrow toward the Arabs.
Which zooms us in geographically and genealogically. But the sources then get hyper-specific about how this prophet will actually receive his message. And I want to check in with you, the listener, for a second. Imagine being handed a book and being commanded to read it, but you are completely illiterate.
It's a daunting scenario.
That is the exact scenario described in the book of Isaiah, chapter 29.
Yes, the prophecy there describes a sealed book being delivered to a man who is not learned. The phrasing is incredibly direct. The book is handed to the unlearned man, and he is commanded, "Read this." And the man replies, "I am not learned."
Anyone familiar with the historical narrative of Islam will instantly recognize this. According to the Islamic sources, this perfectly mirrors the prophet's very first revelation in the cave of Hira.
Word for word.
Right. The angel Gabriel appears to an unlettered man, commands him to read, and Prophet Muhammad famously replies, "I cannot read." But the sources highlight a linguistic connection here that is wild.
The Hebrew translation.
Yeah. If you looked at the original Hebrew text of Isaiah, the word used for the command read is kara. It is practically identical in pronunciation and meaning to the Arabic word ikra, which is the exact first word of the Quran revealed in that cave.
It's a striking detail.
But wait, I have to play devil's advocate here again. Hebrew and Arabic are both Semitic languages, right? They share a massive amount of root words. Couldn't kara and ikra sounding similar just be a basic linguistic coincidence? How do the sources handle the possibility that people are just retrofitting a common word?
It's a valid question. If it were just an isolated word, you could easily dismiss it as a linguistic coincidence. But the sources argue you have to look at the surrounding contextual qualifiers. It isn't just the word read. It is the specific scenario of a divine text being handed to a man who is explicitly described as unlearned. That man being commanded with a specific phonetic root, and his verbatim response being an admission of his inability to read.
So it's a combination of all those factors.
Right. Compiling all those specific variables takes it out of the realm of coincidence and places it into the realm of precise anticipation. It fulfills the other half of the Deuteronomy prophecy, "I will put my words in his mouth."
Because if he can't read or write, he isn't synthesizing older texts.
Yeah.
He is simply speaking what is placed into his mouth.
Exactly.
Okay, so the sources have given us the lineage, the leadership style, and the exact dialogue of his first revelation. But they go even further. They essentially pull out a geographic map and a historical timeline. Let's look at the book of Habakkuk, chapter 3, verse 3.
The verse reads, "God came from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. His glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise."
Hold on, slow down. I'm losing the geography here. We are talking about Arabia. Where exactly are Teman and Mount Paran relative to Medina or Mecca? Like, why do these ancient names matter?
According to the biblical dictionaries referenced by our sources, Teman represents an oasis area that historically corresponds to Medina.
Okay.
Mount Paran is the ancient biblical name associated with the region of Mecca, specifically the wilderness where Abraham left Hagar and Ishmael.
Okay, so when the text says the Holy One comes from Mount Paran and God comes from Teman, the sources argue this is flawlessly mapping the Hijra.
Exactly, the migration. It outlines that the prophet emerges from Mecca, which is Paran, but the true establishment of the religion, the divine sanctuary, comes from Medina, which is Teman. And there is a brilliant linguistic note here as well. The name Muhammad literally translates to the praised one.
Right.
So when Habakkuk concludes with "the earth was full of his praise," the sources suggest this is a literal translation of his name echoing globally.
And the map gets even more granular in Isaiah 21. It prophesies a chariot of asses and a chariot of camels. The sources note that while Jesus famously rode a donkey into Jerusalem, the world historical prophet definitively known for riding a camel is Prophet Muhammad.
It's a very clear distinction in the transportation.
But Isaiah 21 doesn't just stop at transport. It provides an actual timeline. It talks about the inhabitants of the land of Tema bringing water and bread to him who fled from the drawn sword.
Which is a remarkably vivid description of the Hijra. Fleeing the assassins in Mecca, the drawn sword, and arriving in Medina, where the local population, known historically as the Ansar or the Helpers, supported him with food and shelter.
The details are just so specific.
But the most stunning part of Isaiah 21 is verse 16, which drops a hard historical timestamp.
Let's hear it.
It states, "Within a year, all the glory of Kedar shall fail, and the mighty men of the children of Kedar shall be diminished."
Okay, so to decode this timeline, we need to know who Kedar is. If you look at the book of Genesis, Kedar is listed as the second son of Ishmael. Historically, the descendants of Kedar are the Quraysh,
Right, the powerful ruling tribe of Mecca.
the very tribe that had brutally persecuted the early Muslims and forced them to flee. So the text is saying within exactly 1 year of him fleeing the drawn sword, the glory of the Quraysh will fail. What happens exactly 1 year after the migration?
The Battle of Badr. In the second year of Hijra, which is roughly a year after the migration, the most decisive historical shift of that era occurs.
The mighty men fell.
Yes, the fierce opposition leaders of the Quraysh who had driven him out fell at Badr. The sources argue their glory failed exactly on the schedule laid out by Isaiah centuries prior.
This brings me back to the blockchain analogy we talked about earlier. A human making a vague guess about the future might say, oh, a great leader will rise.
Sure, people do that all the time.
But to get the specific mountain he comes from, the oasis he flees to, the method of his transport, his illiteracy, and the exact 1-year timeline of his first major military victory. The texts we are exploring today argue that this level of detail requires a divinely orchestrated legacy.
And the texts follow this legacy all the way to its grand climax. We've traced his coming, his revelation, and his migration. But the sources conclude this deep dive by looking at the monumental peak of his life as foreseen by the prophets before him, specifically in Deuteronomy 33, verse 2.
Let me pull that up. This text tracks the progression of divine messages geographically. It says, the Lord came from Sinai and rose up from Seir unto them. He shined forth from Mount Paran, and he came with 10,000s of saints. From his right hand went a fiery law for them.
The sources interpret this as a metaphor for the progression of revelation. Sinai represents the law of Moses. Seir, a mountain range associated with the region of Jesus, represents his message. But the final, culminating light shines forth from Mount Paran, Mecca, and it specifies 2 things. He comes with 10,000s of saints, and he brings a fiery law of truth and justice in his right hand.
I have to say, the emotional weight the sources place on this specific image is massive.
Yeah.
Because historically, the 10,000 saints is not just poetic imagery.
No, it's a literal historical event.
Right. When Prophet Muhammad finally returned to open Mecca, ending years of brutal persecution, not with vengeance, but with the declaration of absolute amnesty, he was accompanied by exactly 10,000 of his devoted Sahaba, his companions.
It gives you chills.
It really does. The sources present this as the triumphant, breathtaking culmination of a promise made at the dawn of time.
It is framed as the ultimate resolution of the grand design. The sources also connect this climax to the Gospel of John, chapter 16, where Jesus promises the arrival of the Comforter or the Spirit of Truth.
What does that text say exactly?
It says this figure will not speak on his own authority, but will only speak what he hears from God, guiding humanity into all truth.
And the sources argue that this ultimate truth, the fiery law in his right hand, is the Quran itself. A text they emphasize has remained perfectly preserved, actively challenging humanity to produce even a single chapter like it.
That preservation is key to the entire argument we've unpacked today. The narrative presented by these sources is that this unlettered man, speaking words placed into his mouth, changed the molecular structure of human history.
Wow.
They argue that this dense web of fulfilled anticipation is precisely why he remains the most praised and consequential figure to ever live.
Which brings us to the end of this incredibly dense map. I mean, we started today with a local rumor in an Arabian courtyard. A young boy in a fur gown listening to a neighbor who had migrated based on ancient clues.
And we traced those clues through the text.
Oh, right, finding the nation-building metrics of Moses, the exact Arabic command to read, the migration from Priyan to Teman, the 1-year countdown to the fall of the Quraysh, and that monumental return of 10,000 companions.
Exploring these sources forces you to reconsider how historical narratives are constructed. The texts argue these weren't isolated, spontaneous events. They present them as the intentional, interconnected strokes of a massive masterpiece coming to its final resolution.
If you look at history through the lens of the sources we examine today, it leaves you with a profound question to ponder. When completely different eras, disparate languages, and ancient texts all converge like perfectly cut puzzle pieces to verify the arrival of one single human being, what does that tell you about the architecture of human history?
It's a huge question.
It is. If the narrative we explore today is right, and his legacy was actively awaited, tracked, and mapped out for thousands of years before he even took his first breath, how should we, looking back now, measure the profound